Hawaii. This is Pokala Inui, and you are listening to Hawaiian Potpourri. We just listened to the song "What a Wonderful World" by Brother Israel Kamakavivo Ole, and I guess it tells you a matter of approach. If you have a positive approach, it can be a wonderful world. You may be deluding yourself. But it's a better delusion than to be deluding yourself in the other direction. The last caller that we had spoke about Richard Perkins. I think he has something to pick. And Richard Perkins was recently in the news for his outrageous sentence of this young lad who got into an accident. As far as I could see, that was what it was. And he was careless. And so to a certain extent, he was a primary cause of the accident, driving one of those ski mobiles and struck this girl, a young teenager, who was in the water and killed her. I think the scenario was very bad in that the family of the girl who died talked about forgiveness, but was very insistent that this young lad be held absolutely responsible and pay a high price. An earlier judge had determined that his bail would be at $100,000, which was very difficult for his family to make. The lad was here from Australia on a vacation, and this young man was not able to make the bail, was kept in jail for 12 days. The family had to come from Australia to Hawaii and took some time to raise that kind of money to get the boy out of jail and to start working with him. He declared a no contest to the accusation that was brought that he was responsible for this manslaughter. I think that was the charge. It was unintentional, but yet it resolved itself in the death of a young girl. Richard Perkins finally entered a sentence for this young man, and the sentence was to serve 12 days in incarceration, and he would count the 12 days already served as meeting the sentence requirement. There may have been other conditions attached to the sentence, and in essence, the boy was finally released. You know, there are times in everyone's life, and I too, just last night, made a very bad mistake of not seeing, and this was at night. The roads were somewhat darkened. There was traffic moving along, but I didn't see a person or a family in a crosswalk. They were right in front of another car. The lane that I was in was open, and I didn't even expect that there were people walking, and I went past that that crosswalk. So I violated the law. I admit it, and very fortunately I didn't hit anyone. But it was a violation. It wasn't my intention. It was, if I had injured anyone, it would have been purely by accident. And many of us go through those periods in which we make a mistake. A mistake, not necessarily intentional, maybe careless, but that doesn't mean that as a result of that, a person needs to spend the rest of his life in jail or a year in jail or other things like that. I thought Richard Perkins was very humane, was appropriate, and in this case, I thought that was what was needed in the Hawaii society, both for the society side as well as for that particular case, because the news media kept reciting the family's pain and only only told that story, and they didn't tell the other story. And so Richard Perkins, when he got a hold of a case, I thought it was a very humane determination that he had made in that particular case. Our telephone number here is 524-1080, and let's go to that telephone line. Aloha caller, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Polka. How are you?
Yes, good morning. Fine.
Good. I wanted to add on to the discussion of mental health that you were talking about.
Yes, go ahead.
First I want to say that the callers and the listening audience and yourself, one of the reasons why I enjoy this show and look forward to it both on Saturday and Sunday is that it not only provides a critical analysis of a broad range of issues, but the audience, the callers, yourself, go beyond what many radio shows like this do, which is to offer suggestions or to point out institutions or agencies that are making an effort to more effectively deal with the various issues. So it's combining critical analysis with contributions that are being made and not getting caught up in the cancer of cynicism that seems to be rampant in our society. So I appreciate the callers and the audience and yourself. One of the things I would say is that various forms of mental illness like major depression really is statistically at epidemic proportions in our society. The use of pharmaceutical antidepressants are the most widely used pharmaceutical products in our society. And it really begs the question, what kind of society helps to foster this sort of mental distress in such a large portion of the society?
Yeah.
And, I do find, and maybe we might disagree on this, that there is certainly some utility on medications for depression and for problems with schizophrenia and bipolar.
And I would agree with you. Yeah, there is some appropriate use for it, yeah.
I think there are some benefits in traditional Western therapeutic approaches in counseling and therapy, but they really fall far short. And I've called into your show to provide some critical reflection on the type of society we're living in and the sort of crisis that we're in, and make the suggestion that while the efforts, such as the article on the front page of the Star Bulletin today with psychiatrists working with IHS workers, is an important step and might be effective if they move into the community-based and relationship building that provides continuity of care. So that I have a sense of hopefulness. But I would say again to you and your listening audience, unless we began to exercise our right to dream of a new society that's grounded in hope and responsibility, we're not going to see significant changes in these problems with mental health issues or other problems. And I wanted to say, having kind of presented something we need to do, some of your callers may say, oh boy, this guy is talking out of his hat, he's talking about major changes. I do want to point to two forces in the mental health professions that are actually doing things to try to create structural change. The multicultural counseling movement is about 40 years since its genesis, and it was really originated by a handful of African-American psychologists who expressed dissatisfaction with traditional forms of help and talked about the need to change the context, the environment, the schools, the neighborhoods, the communities, the workplaces, and to deal with difficult issues like racism and poverty and classism. And over the 40 years, there have been changes in various aspects of the psychology and counseling profession. But I wanted to draw your attention to a new movement, and I have had the honor of working with colleagues in the counseling field that have founded a social justice counseling association in the major counseling organization called the American Counseling Association. And we are dealing directly with social injustices as they represent a basis for mental illness and mental health problems. And I see the work that we're doing nationally is very consistent with the pace-setting work. I am familiar with the Clubhouse and the work of Hawaiian Potpourri, and it's very consistent. And we do come under attack as a national organization, but it's good to see some consistency between what we're doing nationally and what you're doing here in the state. And the approach that you're using with this Voyage to Recovery program and other programs, I believe will be integrated into the mainstream as long as there's enough ongoing commitment by you and your staff. So I just want to extend a personal thank you and to let other people know that these are not pie-in-the-sky dreams. These are practical, institutionalized efforts to really create change. And perhaps I'm kind of bantering a bit, but I just wanted to share that perspective.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for laying it out so methodically. Thank you for your call. Aloha. And if you would like to call, our telephone number is 524-1080. Let's go to our next caller. Aloha caller, welcome to the program.
Sorry, Poke, it's me again. I'd like to respond to something
Go ahead.
I heard in Michael's comments, and it'll be short. In thinking about the prevalence of depression and how I had thought that it affects women more than men, but that's another question which I have found a possible answer to, is that I used words and put depression in line with this as I see it. Depression occurs when oppression, suppression, repression, and then depression. And I follow that particular line of thought because it leads me to where I see so many women being depressed. Now, the reason I thought women were more frequently depressed than men was because of statistics, but now I have heard or read that men may be equally or more depressed, but they self-medicate by mostly alcohol, and they become alcoholics, but they are using the drugs to alleviate this oppression, and their way of doing it is to use alcohol. So then they're put in an entirely different category in statistical research. Well, I'll let go of my addiction, and that's words, and something I cannot give up. It's made a dent in my nervous system. Thank you.
Thanks for your call. Aloha. And if you would like to call and join in this conversation, and it need not be taking any particular position, just to ask questions or engage in a conversation, you're welcome to call. And what is the word for it? Ruminate. Is that the word? on your thoughts on some of these issues. Michael earlier called and talked about these two major movements in the field of mental health that are more recent, more current, and yet he talks about it 40 years ago. And it may be a matter of just aging. On one hand, if you look at 40 years ago, it may seem to some as a long period of time, and to others a very recent move. And sometimes when a movement begins initially 40 years ago, it doesn't really catch up or get accepted within the broader community, or even is known within the broader community until a time later. As an example, the style of case management services, integrating it with all the other services that I had talked about at Hawaiian Potpourri, that occurred over 10 years ago, and now as a sort of a newfound combined approach for services by IHS and the School of Medicine at the university, this seems to be this new development of bringing the psychiatrists into the community. What a wonderful new discovery we have made. So oftentimes the kinds of stuff that we are creating may have been created previously, but because of the short memories or the fact that we don't want to go back into a past and rediscover all the wonderful things that had been done previously, we remake it into a new idea, a new thought. And so I think many of the practices that were effective in the past should be reviewed and found out why they were effective, and some things could be replicated, and we might find some treasure in that. So Michael talked about this multicultural counseling movement, and one of our rules, among our 5 golden rules, 2 of the golden rules would probably be applicable here. The first golden rule is he who has a gold rules. Okay, and I won't get any further into that. The second golden rule says, do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. And that addresses culture, and that says essentially, what is your culture? What is your expectation? What are the views of yourself and of the institution that you represent? Because those are themselves cultural perspectives as you go out into the community and apply them. So be clear about who you are, what your expectations are. The third golden rule is do unto others as they would have you do unto them, which calls for that cultural sensitivity and an understanding from their perspective of what their expectations or their desires are. And that's, as we talked earlier about going out and working with the homeless. How do they see the idea of inviting people into their homes, whether or not the home is just some cardboard boxes, or it's under a bridge or next to a river or other places? And so it calls for that sensitivity. So I think that's part of this multicultural counseling movement. And it's not only conditions of changed expectations, but cultures themselves. We have cultures, especially in Hawaii, with the sort of the meeting of East and West, that the culture of psychiatric services, of counseling services, its roots are in a Western American culture. And yet, when you come across a person who comes from Asia, whether it's from Vietnam or some of the Pacific Island areas, they come from a different culture with different expectations, with a different way of treating someone who is interpreted by Western medicine as suffering from mental illness. So I think this idea of being multicultural and being appropriate to multicultural counseling techniques are very important. The second was social justice counseling. Social justice counseling, I think, is another way of seeing, and when you talk about social justice, you're talking about a very broad perspective, both political injustices that the client may come from, or from the culture that they come from, or the people that they come from. It may be the economic injustices, the educational injustices, all of these social disparities between the rich and the poor. And usually it's a rich groupings that are the service providers on the giving end, and it's people who come from different social environments on the receiving end. And what is the impact of those who have suffered these injustices socially that affect and bring about sometimes the mental illness, or exacerbate the conditions under which they would normally be, or keep them under mental illness. And those are considerations that are not normally or greatly expected within the schools that teach about becoming involved, so that when you deal with the issues of mental illness, oftentimes they take it directly out of what's coming out of Europe or what's coming out of America in those schools that are not necessarily in touch with communities in which these practices are actually delivered. So I think those two movements are in fact very, very important movement. For me, if there was and maybe litmus test is not the appropriate term, but there was a central core around which we see the division of the area of mental illness, I would come right back to what I have said many times on this radio station. And you may think that I'm beating a dead rag to death. I don't know what term you would use, but it is the idea of DIE versus OLA. One approach to medicine is domination, individualism, and exclusion. And so just the idea of the illness, it needs to be dominated, it needs to be eliminated, it needs to be killed off, it needs to be squashed. Okay? Individualism, you treat this individual, himself, herself, and you don't share the information, you don't involve the family, you don't involve the wider community, you don't involve the support system, you just deal with that individual. So you elevate issues of privacy, issues of confidentiality, and don't tell, I won't tell, and we'll keep it a secret among us. That's part of the culture, and it's a very important aspect of the mental health culture, mental illness culture, and medical culture that we deal with. So domination, individualism, and exclusion in terms of sometimes exclusion works in a way of being reserved to the specialist. So if you come from the faith-based organizations, then you are excluded from being part of the treatment because you are not medically trained. Or people from the community, they don't have the appropriate medical skills, so you don't involve them in the appropriate service team. Okay, let's switch it. Let's talk about Ola, Olu Olu, Lokahi, and Aloha. From Ola's side, as you look at the mental illness itself, it's something that needs to be accommodated. It's something that needs to be dealt with, but not eliminated or not excluded, not to be killed out, like any disease or like the enemy. Oftentimes when you press the enemy so much, you may get rid of the enemy, but you get rid of the patient as well. And oftentimes these are merely indications of deeper problems within the system. So a high fever, you want to get rid of the high fever. Hey, you can freeze the body and you get rid of the high fever, but you kill the client. The fever itself is communicating with you and telling you that there are some systemic problems within that individual. Okay, so anyway, domination may not be the appropriate way. Learning to accommodate, dealing with, not to put up with, but dealing with and try to find other ways of, okay, perhaps some of these voices or this imp that sort of gets out of hand, maybe we can put some controls to it, but recognize that it may exist for you as an appropriate early warning system. Okay. So it's a different approach to how we look at illness and how we accommodate appropriately illness. That's part of the OLA system. Lokahi, instead of eliminating or excluding the service providers to a certain group, Lokahi would include a wider group, including family members, including others. Of course, with the permission and consent of the individual being treated. But try to be inclusive and look at the wider perspective rather than only looking at the client. And let's see, Lokahi and Aloha. You need to build that sense of relationship between the parties. Instead of just talking about the professional distance between your provider and your client. No, you need to establish trust. You need to establish good working relationship, not to just kiss up to the client, but to establish certain boundaries. But there need to be a kindness, wellness in that relationship as well. Okay, I've said enough.
Kaulana na pua o Hawaii Kupa ama hope o ka aina Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino Pala pala anunu me ka pata Mane mai Hawaii moku o ke ave Koku ana honoa o Pilani Ka ko'o mai kaua I o mano Pa'aku me ke oni o ka kuhi hewa Aolea e kau I ka pulima Maluna o ka pepa o ka enemi Po o hui ai nā ku ai hewa I ka pono sivila a o ke kanaka Aole makoa e mina mina I ka pu'u ka